Welcome everybody today to a continuing series of Ben webinars. First couple of thoughts is normally we've been holding these webinars 8:30 in the morning on Tuesday. That seems to be a good time. This is, I think, only the second one we've had in the afternoon. So I'm actually very pleased with the number of people that could, carve time out to come in the afternoon. And that might signal that rather than early morning, maybe we'll do, some future webinars in the afternoon as well. So thank you everybody for joining. Today we're going to talk about a very relevant subject, and we're doing again something kind of for the first time for us. We're going to have a panel discussion as opposed to just one speaker. So we haven't tried this yet, so hang with us. But Joe Connors has been kind enough to put together this panel, and we hope to talk today about some of the nuances of a very relevant topic, and that is, protecting information and cybersecurity. And we have a great group of panelists who will lead you through the discussion, as well as take questions either during or at the end of the webinar. Regarding questions, I think what myself, Kate, and Nicole and Ben do is, we do our best to kind of take questions depending on the flow of energy in the room. So if the speakers are going full bore, we might, push the questions back near the end. Sometimes maybe, as they come in the chat function, we'll bring up those questions, as they come in. So hang in there. We'll see everything that you post in the chat function. Please keep your microphones off if you could, and we will be constantly checking that chat function. Last point, why do we do this? I mean, Ben has been holding these webinars over the probably past year or so as a mechanism to try to get really interesting topics in front of a whole host of stakeholders, whether there are portfolio companies or other young companies or others in the region. And so, pleased to do that for this community and want to add as much value as we can. We will be sending out post the webinar. We'll be sending out a quick note to get your feedback. I can tell you we don't always get a lot of feedback, but we appreciate any that we get. So if you can take the time to give us feedback, we're pleased to get it. So with that, we'll get started. Let me introduce our webinar panel today, and I'll do that by kicking it off to Joe Connors. Joe leads a portfolio company, CCR CyberCrunch. They are sort of the last in the food chain in making sure that data is disposed of properly. And Joe will talk a little bit about what they do in the course of the webinar. But Joe is the one who recruited all the other folks on this panel. So very, very pleased to have Brian, Emery, and John joining us. And Joe, with that as an introduction, you have the comm and you can take it from here.
Terrific, Mark. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to Ben Technology Partnership for the ability to share our collective thoughts on this very important topic. With that, I'll flip it to John Frastesi from CDP, who will be the moderator for this webinar.
Good afternoon, everybody, and again, thank you, Mark and Joe, for putting this together. As Joe said, my name is John Frastesi. I'm the founder and president of Communications Deployment Partners. We are a technology consulting group that helps business customers secure voice, data, cloud services, as well as more of an educational forum to discuss things like cybersecurity and why it's becoming such a thorn in so many people's side. With me today, in addition to Joe, is Brian Barnhart with Infiltration Labs. And Brian, maybe you can give us a quick overview of what you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. Brian Barnhart. I'm the owner and operator of Infiltration Labs, which is a digital forensics and incident response company. I'm retired law enforcement, thus the background, if it wasn't obviated by that. I spent the last 4 years of my career working with the United States Secret Service doing digital forensics and responding to network intrusions. After my retirement in 2013, I worked for a couple of private sector companies. And then in 2016, started Infiltration Labs, which really focuses on responding to cyber incidents and kind of positioning small to mid-sized businesses from having incidents in the first place. Thank you again.
Thanks, Brian. And Emery, not last, but certainly not least.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emery Vandiver. I'm with Interactive Security. I'm a partner here in the firm. I pretty much handle the business side of the house here, but we are a pure cybersecurity focused consulting firm, and we essentially work with our clients to do cybersecurity risk assessments. We do compliance audits around security. There's a lot of different compliance and regulatory standards now out there around cybersecurity specifically. So we help our clients prepare for those, as well as take them through that audit process. And again, our goal here is to make sure our clients are avoiding becoming a victim of essentially cyber crime.
Thank you, Emery. At this point, we'll start kicking off, and I'm going to direct our first question to Emery. Emery, maybe you can talk a little bit about what a cybersecurity plan is and why it's important, and some of the components that make up that plan.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great place to start. Cybersecurity planning can be a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it's really about what an organization does to form what we call a cybersecurity program. And a program is something that's, a well-designed, well-executed, and repeatable strategy around cybersecurity. So we talk about it as a living, breathing, constantly evolving process within a company, within an organization. It's not something, that we kind of do once a year and maybe dust it off every 6 to 12 months. It really needs to be something that's ingrained within the organization throughout every department and all its employees. Information technology and the business as a whole is part of that cybersecurity program, to build that defense against the cyber criminals out there. They're basically what we like to refer to as 4 basic components within a cybersecurity program. The first would be baselining. Then we would move on to remediation of gaps or holes that we might have, then documentation, and then maintenance of the program. But to kick it off, baselining, essentially at the heart of it is doing something that we refer to as a cybersecurity risk assessment or a gap analysis. We can't fix problems if we don't know what they are. Basically, so that's the goal of the first step there. The baselining, the gap analysis is to identify what cybersecurity related problems do we have, so we can then look forward really in the next step to fixing them. So we do things like network vulnerability scanning or penetration testing. We do various other exercises to understand where those gaps are. Next would be remediation of those gaps. We've identified the problems. Now it's time to fix them. These can be technology related problems. These can be policy and procedure related problems within the organization. These can be related to staff training. That's a very big part of this, is making sure that our employees within our company are well trained so they know what to avoid and what not to do. It's a holistic strategy around internal operations as well as third-party companies that we might deal with, because we're all sharing information out there these days. Then we would move on to, once we fix our problems, then we would move on to documenting everything. And this is very important, because once we've fixed everything, we need to know what we've done for future reference. We can look back and say, this worked well, this didn't work well. We might need to give documentation of our cybersecurity program to a third party, like a customer or a vendor or some type of regulatory agency who might ask for it. And then once it's documented, it becomes something that's repeatable, manageable, and fluid and flexible as we move forward. Then the last step is going to be maintenance. So we've identified, we've fixed our problems, we've documented everything. It doesn't stop there. Now we have to make sure we maintain it going forward. And this is something that involves, again, the whole company, especially starting from the highest levels, the executive team, making sure that we're keeping our cybersecurity program, our posture strong and, in place as we move forward. And certain things like, maybe an annual risk assessment, just to check up on where we are, doing quarterly or semi-annual testing of different sorts. And then, of course, ongoing employee training is something that is always encouraged. So a lot said there, but John, I think that's kind of a pretty good overview of what we would be talking about there.
Yeah, thank you, Emery. But as a quick follow-up, if you could comment, we kind of gear this toward what we think are large businesses because that's what we see mostly in the news. But the reality is this starts at even the smallest business that has any connectivity to the internet or uses email. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Well, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, John, yes, our portfolio is, the young, small companies. So that's who our audience is out here.
So it's critical if you're not thinking about these things today that one of the reasons for this discussion in general is to get people to start thinking about it. And different organizations and different size organizations have probably more complex requirements, but that doesn't mean that a plan for a smaller business should not start to incorporate things. And they could be as simple as make sure you're changing your passwords every 2 to 3 months to avoid ending up on the dark web. So with that, Brian, who in most businesses, who do we include as the stakeholders when we're developing that cybersecurity plan?
Yeah, thanks, John. Good question. Emery kind of touched on it a couple of times in his response. It really needs to be a top-down approach. Senior leadership has to buy into the program, right? They have to support it, they have to believe in it, and they really have to back it and for it to be successful. As you can imagine, it's usually the top level executives that are targeted in cyber attacks. So again, it's really got to be a top-down approach. It was also mentioned it's got to be a holistic approach, right? So the way I look at it is it's not just an IT problem, right? I know days have passed, we kind of assumed anything that was cyber, anything, right? The IT was the master of all things plugged in, but that's really not the case when it comes to cyber. Think about any sort of cyber attack, whether it be recently or in the past couple of years, who really felt the brunt of that, right? Ultimately, the responsibility falls on executive leadership, right? So it's usually them that kind of feel that impact, if you will. As far as who is typically part of the incident response process or part of the cybersecurity process, kind of your usual suspects, right? You need legal, right? IT is a part of it, senior leadership, executive leadership, so on and so forth. Human resources, right? Why would human resources be part of it? So what if it's not an external cyber threat, but an internal cyber threat, right? Let's assume an employee is stealing data or, right, a disgruntled employee inadvertently releases data out on the internet, right? Human resources needs to be part of that response process. If you have, I know some small companies don't have a communications department or a PIO or what have you, but you really need to have a plan in place for who's going to deliver these messages when something goes south. I think to summarize that is, think of right now, if your business got hit with a ransomware attack and you did not have access to any of your data, and it is suspected that the attackers may actually have exfiltrated some of that data. Who within your organization, who would be part of that response in that decision tree, right? Would legal be part of that? Probably so, right? So really it comes down to that as part of developing a cybersecurity program. And part of that is an incident response plan is let's identify the various stakeholders and who needs to be part of the process.
Thank you, Brian. Joe or Emery, have anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, not
Okay, so, well, thank you, Brian. So following up on some of these liabilities, Emery, maybe you could shed some light on how a customer may be unknowingly be in violation of a contract with a vendor or a customer from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, this is a very important point to make sure we talk about. I'm glad we are, because we here in our company, we're seeing this more and more every day as the weeks go by. As you know, cyber security issues are coming up more and more in the news, and events are happening. Some of the fallout from that is that these larger organizations are now pushing down their cybersecurity requirements onto their what we call supply chain, or all their vendors, all their customers as well. And the reason why they're doing that is because ultimately then that helps protect them as an organization. So what this really means is that regardless of, organization or company size, industry, geography for sure, there is a very good chance that if you haven't already, you're probably going to start seeing cybersecurity language specifically written into contracts. Master services agreements, vendor contracts, customer contracts, whatever it might be. And we've even seen where some customers have signed off on these contracts unknowingly or unwittingly with this language in it, but haven't met the requirements that are being stated, which of course can be a big issue if something were to happen or somebody were to come back around and ask about it. So we're seeing this come up a lot. And these security requirements can be as simple as, hey, we need you to show some evidence that you do some type of cybersecurity assessment once a year, or it could be something much more formal where you're being now required to meet, a cybersecurity standard, something like a HIPAA compliance audit or a SOC 2 or PCI, which is some of the lingo out there. But I often encourage business owners and operators, make sure you review your contracts, make sure you're not missing language that might already be in there, and definitely keep your eye out on contracts as you're signing them that might start seeing this type of language in there.
Guys, just had a question from the participants, and it's really around like liability and indemnification. So clearly, services such as you provide may help today, but it doesn't ensure that there will not be, I guess, a cybersecurity breach. So what do you guys, or what is best in class from folks who guide businesses through this process in terms of liability or indemnification to clients, if indeed they're doing all the right things, but still there is a breach?
I'll tackle that, or at least part of it. So you're 100% right. There's nothing that you're going to put in place. There's no magic bullet, right? There's no silver bullet that's going to stop every cyber attack. So I think one of the misnomers or one of the confusing things that we hear is people say, well, if it's a given that we're going to be attacked, why put all this money into it? The analogy that I would use, anybody that's heard my presentations knows that I love analogies, is getting in your car and driving up the road, right? That's a risk, but it's a calculated risk, right? Hopefully we can afford a quality car, right, that has airbags and other safety features. We still put on our seatbelt. Hopefully we're not consuming alcohol before we drive, but at the end of the day, it's still a risk, right? We're still taking that risk of getting in the car and driving up the road. No different from the cyber world, right? There's no magic thing that's going to completely indemnify you from any sort of liability. But the goal of a cybersecurity plan is you have those puzzle pieces put in place so that you're able to minimize that risk, right? You're minimizing that liability so that when something happens, you can say, hey, I did everything right? I had all of the right pieces there. We responded as best we could. I don't know if that entirely answered the question or just muddied the waters a little bit.
No, thank you. Thank you.
No, I think just to add on to that, Mark, again, part of this plan is kind of getting your ducks in a row with the understanding that no matter what degree of planning you do, there is there may come a time where there is an incursion or a theft, and it comes down to, do you have the right response plan in place? And how important is the data, for example? Like, how quickly do you need to be able to recover from it? And some of those things become cost factors. We're going to talk about cybersecurity insurance for a little bit here. And there are all levels of insurance that you can purchase. And like any other insurance, the more that you spend, the more coverage you'll have. Assuming that you provide the right information to be considered a reasonable risk, as opposed to, that it's like car insurance, right? If you have all the safety features in place and you've got a good driving record, you're going to get more of a preferred rate than the person that's had 10 accidents and 3 DUIs, and becomes a higher risk to the insurance company. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that now, and I was going to ask Joe to dig in a little deeper with regard to what cyber insurance is, and what can a customer expect it to cover.
Will do. Cyber insurance is relatively new in the past 20 years as data became more accessible to the outside world, hidden behind the AS400 or even the tape drives of LEOs from years ago. But the current the typical cyber theft insurance policy includes data breaches, intellectual property rights, damages to third-party systems failure, cyber extortion, and the business interruption from a cyber point of view. So let's chat briefly about data breaches. That includes items such as identity theft protection for the affected. When companies are operating online, there is a heightened risk. The companies don't transmit the personal data over the internet. There's a myriad of discussion points. Intellectual property rights is essentially your footprint on the World Wide Web. So what's your company's online presence? Are you a B2B? Are you B2C? Is everything coming through your corporate website? Is it blogs? Is it social media? There's all kinds of issues you have to deal with, including the people that provide you, whether it be vendors or customers, with the appropriate feedback. Damages to third parties. If an email from your server was via virus was sent to another company, whether it be you as a vendor or you as a customer, and it crashes that appropriate system, is there a resulting loss for the third party? System failure. Typically would be natural disaster, whether it be fire in the far west, whether it be floods in the south, floods in this that we had this past Saturday up in the Northeast in the Trenton area. Cyber extortion, and everybody's familiar with this, such as the hijacking local websites, the networks, the data stored on denying access to your systems. They demand money to restore, whether it be ransomware or any other type of service you consider. It's a temporary inconvenience, or it could put you out of business and effectively ruin your company. Business interruption. This transcends all facets of your business, starting with the use of the computer systems, a disaster, inability to transmit your data. I mean, let's face it, everybody lives on data. It's not like in the old days. You have to understand that your data is shared with the world. And so it's not just with your employees only. So you have to provide the day-to-day operations, incident reporting. You have to understand where your data is going, who has access to it, and put the appropriate steps in place. That is, in summary, most of the types of coverage that you can get. I won't get into the technical side, but from a small business point of view, the simple answer is you need to understand what coverage you do have and sit and think from a common sense point of view, what do I need to protect? John?
Thank you, Joe. I think it's important to note on the insurance front that, that coverage allows you to provide some level of recovery. But in terms of the breaches themselves, there are emerging state laws and guidelines with regard to privacy breaches and penalties and fines and litigation that all feed back into why we need to embrace this at pretty much every level, whether you're an enterprise, a large enterprise, multinational, or a small mom and pop that is doing a lot of web-based sales, and the potential to lose that customer list or customer information not only is problematic from the theft perspective, but the regulatory environment is evolving in such a way that your liability will continue to grow, and lawyers will continue to make more money exploiting that. So that's something else to be aware of. But Brian, let's talk about what types of cyber attacks there are, what categories they fall into, and how do you know when you've been attacked?
Yeah, for sure. So I've said this before, I could spend all day talking about the different types of cyber attacks out there, but we'll kind of focus on the main ones, the ones that everybody probably wants to hear about or doesn't want to hear about. We're going to talk about ransomware, email compromises, right? Also known as BEC, or business email compromise. And then got to be timely here, we're going to talk about supply chain attacks and 0 days. So we'll start with ransomware. Just in case you've been living under a rock and you're not sure what ransomware is, essentially it is malware that lands on your computer and it encrypts all of the data and or locks the computer, and it demands some sort of a ransom in order to get access to your data again. I think it's starting to, right, or it's been evolving into, once upon a time, it was really easy to say, hey, we got hit with ransomware, we have good backups, let's just restore from backup. The attackers got wise to this, and they decided, hey, we're going to kind of spin this into ransomware and a cyber extortion. So now what happens a lot of times is you get hit with the ransomware, and then they send you that follow-up saying, hey, here's what you have to pay in order to get this data back or access to your data again, but we also exfiltrated data. And if you don't pay our ransom demand, we're going to start bleeding this information out onto the internet, right? And a lot of times it's obviously very sensitive information. I think to stay on ransomware here for a minute, I think one of the things that we need to focus on, and I won't name drop, right, because I don't want to beat up on any company in particular, but we had a company recently that got hit with ransomware. Initially, they weren't going to pay the ransom because they had good backups. And essentially what happened was they discovered that the process of restoring hundreds of systems was a bigger endeavor than if they were to just pay the ransom and have that data decrypted, right? So that's one of the things, that's one of my takeaways for this is when it comes to ransomware, right, and keeping good backups, you might want to explore that, right? A, you keep good backups. Are they good? Do they actually work, right? And I realize that a lot of times what we'll do is we'll test 1, 2, maybe 3 systems, but think about that on an enterprise level and even a small mid-sized business level. How long would it take you to actually restore a couple of dozen servers, right? Or even just a handful of servers and a few dozen endpoints, right? So one of the things to kind of think about when it comes to ransomware. Email compromise. Email compromise is where someone manages to get into your email system, right? They've hacked your email, right? Or they've hacked your Office 365, your Google Workspace, whatever it may be. And now they are able to manipulate emails that either come into you or that you send out to others. A lot of times this is kind of a supply chain attack in the sense that they will alter invoices that are going out or coming in, and they change those wire instructions. It is really, really common. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm willing to bet that at least 1 or 2 people that are on this call right now have probably suffered some sort of an email compromise, right? Whether somebody called you up and emailed you and said, hey, I just got a bunch of emails from you to click on this link, right? Or to log into this site or whatever it may be. Or maybe they altered an invoice. It's real common with, drawing a blank, title companies and real estate. Supply chain attacks in 0 days. So I figured I had to add this in, right? Because Kaseya, as of recent, the solar winds attack, even right down to a simple, the print nightmare attack, right? Or the print nightmare exploit. A lot of times what I hear from businesses, especially smaller businesses, is, well, these were 0 days, right? These are nation state attackers. How could we have defended against this? And it's really not so, it's not so much about how do you defend against it, it's how do you respond to this sort of an attack, right? Again, just because something was unavoidable doesn't mean that it wasn't detectable, right? Or it was undetectable. A lot of these attacks, right? Even the nation state one, the Kaseya and the Solar Winds, these are attacks that a lot of the actions that the attackers took, they were detectable, right? If the proper monitoring or the visibility had been put in place in those environments, you would see the accounts being created. You would see the attacker's lateral movement, right? So just because something's a 0 day or a nation state actor doesn't mean that it completely flies under the radar. The initial attack may fly under the radar, but you can put things in place. And this kind of bleeds into, again, with the ransomware, the email compromise, and the supply chain attacks. You really need to have, other than the preemptive stuff in place, is we need to conduct what's called root cause analysis. And again, the analogy that I use is you just showed up at home and you just discovered that a lot of your valuables are just missing. You have no idea how, but all of your valuables are missing. What would you do, right? You would probably call the police, you would call some sort of investigator, and they would try to determine how did these burglars, right? How did the bad guys get into your environment, right? What you wouldn't do is just knee jerk and start changing locks, putting new latches on windows, so on and so forth, though those may be needed. Without understanding how the attackers got into your environment, it's kind of a moot point. And the same applies in the cyber world, right? Whether it be ransomware, an email compromise, a supply chain attack, a 0 day, or just a full-blown data breach, root cause analysis is what helps you identify some of those lingering questions that most businesses have is, how did they get in? When did they actually get in? Right? What did they do? Did they target any specific data? Did they take any data? What else? There was something else I wanted to say about that. And are we still at risk, right? What else did they do while they were in my environment, right? Did they move across systems? And again, this is real common. I know I keep beating up on the ransomware thing, but it's real common for businesses to say, we got hit with ransomware, we have good backups, we're gonna nuke that system and restore, and we're back and operational. The challenge with that is, unless you can conclusively say, this is the method the attackers use to get into your environment, what are you doing, right? What are you protecting against? How do you know they didn't land on Susan's computer in reception? Maybe they hacked her computer first with a phishing email, and then they pivoted through the environment and then deployed ransomware. Well, congratulations, you've managed to secure the computers that got ransomware, but that initial infection vector, right? The initial way that they got in, that may still be a persistence mechanism for them to get back. So I know that I'm going to beat up on that quite a bit. How do you know that you've been attacked? How do you know? Well, I think with ransomware, it's pretty obvious, right? We can't access our data. With email, typically somebody notifies us. I think the scarier ones, right? What we should be more concerned with is the advanced attackers. I hate using that word. The attackers that get into your environment and they're there to just siphon off information, right? Because they're going to fly under the radar, right? They're not going to ring the loud alarm bell of ransomware that lets you know that there's a problem. The average time from the moment you've been breached until detection is 230 days. That's give or take. That's over 7 months that an attacker has been in your environment, moving around, doing what they need to do, doing reconnaissance before they typically deploy whatever it is that they want to do, or before they're detected, right? At that point, they've probably already exfiltrated the data. And when I come in to investigate an environment where an attacker has been in for a few months or more, that's really challenging, right? Because they've had a lot of time to embed themselves in the environment, and a lot of the artifacts that we need to be able to conclusively have a start point and an end point, a lot of those puzzle pieces are just missing. So I think preemptively detecting attacks requires preparation.
So Brian, when they're hacked, you address some of the steps that need to be taken, and what can a small, medium-sized business expect in terms of being able to restore themselves, and what pieces of the puzzle should they be, rather than rush to conclusion or restoral. To your earlier point, needing to understand what happened and how it happened and how that gets shut down. So maybe you can continue and touch on that a little bit.
So I think as far as how quickly they can kind of bounce back from it, it really depends on your level of preparation, right? I think it's like anything else. If you get hit with an attack or any kind of a situation and you haven't put a plan in place, typically we respond incorrectly, right? We have that panic, that knee-jerk response, and we trample over evidence, or we just start wiping systems, so on and so forth. So response time really, really, really does hinge on how well you've prepared initially. And that's that cybersecurity plan. That's that incident response plan is, hey, think of it like a fire drill, right? We know that if this alarm goes off, here are the steps we take, right? It's a playbook. Break in case of emergency, here's what we do. And that's really how you're going to be able to answer those lingering questions of how did it happen? When did it happen? So on and so forth. So again, I know I'm going to keep harping on it, is have a plan. If you've planned for an incident, so the numbers, right? Numbers lie and stuff of that sort. But the average cost of a breach for organizations up there on the screen without an incident response plan and without testing that incident response plan is $5.2 million, right? If an organization has an incident response plan and they've tested that incident response plan and they know that it works, it usually drops it down to 3.2. That's a big difference, right? That's a significant difference. And that kind of lends into the average time that it takes to get back up and running, right? So remember we said 230 days from the time that an attack happened until the time that you've discovered it, right? Just over 7 months before you detect it. Typically the containment, right, and the remediation is another 69 to 85 days, right? So you can see how long it might take, right? Almost a year or more to get back up and operational. If you have an incident response plan, it minimizes the numbers significantly, right? Which in turn minimizes the impact and the financial damage. Let's take ransomware as an example. Most organizations get hit with ransomware, even small businesses, they get hit with ransomware, and the average downtime is about 2 to 3 weeks, right? Before everything is completely back up and operational, right? And we can use all of these systems. So just do some quick math on that. If you're down, if your business is down or critical systems are down for even a week and a half, what does that cost you, right? What kind of damage to the business does that do? We're not even talking about reputational damage, just actual financial operational costs. If you have a response plan and a competent incident response team, the moment that you discover that there's an incident, you enact that plan and everything starts flowing a lot smoother, right? Again, we'll use the fire alarm drill. If you have a 12-story building and there's no fire drill, no plan, and you ring that bell, people are going to panic, freak out, and it's going to be a mess getting out that door. If you have a fire drill, right, you have a plan in place, right, and everybody knows what path they're to take, you exit that building so much faster. Again, same thing applies with the cybersecurity response. If you have a plan and you have the processes in place, you minimize the amount of time that it takes to detect it, you minimize the amount of time that it takes to respond, and you minimize the amount of time that it takes to mitigate, remediate, and get everything back up and running. So again, being preemptive really, really is what's going to make the big difference.
So Brian, having that incident response plan in place is really kind of a subset of your overall cybersecurity plan, and I'm almost afraid to ask the question, Emery, because I think we know the answer, but there doesn't seem to be a way that you can totally prevent a cyber attack from happening.
Yeah, no surprise in the answer to that question. Unfortunately, the answer is no. Cyber threats are never going to be able to be totally prevented against, unfortunately. And the reason is that these threats are changing minute by minute every day. And the cyber criminals out there, these are highly skilled, highly paid experts. They're well organized. They're working for, large crime syndicates most of the time. So this isn't the stereotypical, some lone kid in a basement somewhere overseas. Sometimes it is, but many times it's part of a well-organized machine out there. So like I said, it's very profitable. It's very hard to prosecute these individuals, these criminals. So it's going to persist, and it's unfortunately probably only going to get worse than it is even today. But here's the good news. The good news is that if an organization wants to prioritize this, which they definitely should, because it's probably the biggest risk to their business these days, frankly, if they're willing to prioritize it and, dig in and build a good cybersecurity program, they can greatly reduce the chances of themselves becoming a victim. With a little bit of effort, without an astronomical budget thrown at this, an organization can really decrease their exposures and protect themselves and not become a victim in the first place. And that's really the goal. Individuals out there and companies out there like Brian's are super important, because there will be attacks, there will be cyber criminals who will succeed, and those organizations unfortunately are going to need the services of an individual or company like Brian's. But there can be a lot done without a huge investment in time or money or resources to reduce your chances greatly. One of the things that people don't understand is that a lot of these cyber criminals are just starting by throwing and casting a very wide net out there on the internet just to see what they can find. It's anonymous, etc. So they're going to get some bites, and then they're going to start digging into those bites. If you are smart and prevent yourself from being one of those nibbling fish on the line by putting in place a good cybersecurity program, then you're in a much better place. So that's the overall message. This is cybersecurity is probably the biggest risk to most organizations out there today. Do yourself a favor, make it a priority, make the modest investment, when you really think about it, into it up front. Protect yourself and don't become one of the victims.
Emery, would it be safe to say, especially with a lot of smaller businesses, when you start really talking about a full-blown cybersecurity plan and implementation, that budget can look a lot bigger than many companies are willing to handle. Would it be safe to say that if you create the strategy, that you can implement it over an extended period of time? And I would liken it this way: if I have 0 today and within 12 months I can get the 50%, and maybe in 24 months I can get the 75%, knowing that you're never going to get to 100, is the moral of the story ultimately going to be, if we're not doing anything, we need to start doing something, and start down a path to having a better vision of how this impacts your business, and recognizing that the cost, while nobody likes to spend money on these types of insurance activities, it's simply becoming a must-have in terms of owning and operating a business of any size.
Yes, absolutely, John. Something is better than nothing. A little more is always better than a little less. Rome was not built in a day, right? We can talk about all these cliches out there, but doing something, putting some level of a cybersecurity plan in place is 100% better than not doing that. And there's a illustration out there that I've seen on LinkedIn and other places on the internet many times, and every time I see it, it rings true. the cybersecurity budget before the breach compared to the cybersecurity budget within an organization after the breach, right, is like, we'll give you every dollar we have if we could avoid it, right, after it happens. So that's the way that organizations need to think about this. This could be literally the end of a company. And we see that all the time, especially when it's smaller organizations who can sustain themselves for weeks or months of not being able to function as a business. So I think ownership of organizations really need to understand how big of a risk this is, and think about it as a business risk that they have to protect against, not just another IT budget line item they need to, fund. So, but yeah, absolutely. Anything you can do to move towards, a full cybersecurity plan is multitudes better than not doing that.
No, I thank you for following up on that. One of the pieces that I think a lot of people assume is, we upgrade our equipment and we leave it. What do we do with the old stuff? And Joe, I wanted to point this to you with regard to, the destruction of old data to secure it, and talk a little bit about how that and data equipment recycling are related.
Yeah, thanks, John. The three elements that you need to focus on is, number one, avoid the theft of your and your customers' data. Number two, comply with the regulatory environment with validation, which means documentation. And the third is to avoid exposures to penalty and litigation, because there will be penalties and litigation. Remember, a third of all data breaches come from the loss of data related to old equipment.
So from that regard, the recycling, I mean, when we talk about recycling, we think we're healthy, it's good for the environment, but it kind of has an implied purpose in that you're able to meet all of these types of requirements, in addition to, emptying that storeroom that has a bunch of old equipment in it that we don't know what to do with, right?
Absolutely. I would, most people that are small companies really don't think about recycling and or data destruction until their closets are filled up, or their new equipment comes in and they have no more room for the old equipment. So if they spent even a nominal cost, and recycling of electronics does cost money. More important, the data destruction costs money. As I tell people, just as an instance, for typical data destruction, it's less than 1 hour of your outside legal counsel. And if you have a data breach, you'll have more than 1 hour.
Something to ponder. We're drawing this to a close, but I wanted to make a point and throw it open to all of you. A lot of small businesses use an IT support organization, whether they're an MSP or it's your IT guy or it's your brother-in-law, and they handle, the assumption is that they're handling a lot of the security pieces when they're helping you build out your network. One of the challenges that we see with our customers is like an assumption being made that person or that group is assuming full responsibility or liability in the event that there is some kind of breach or incursion. So maybe you guys can tell us a little bit about making sure that you understand what your relationship is with your third-party IT support person, because a misunderstanding of that relationship, again, is probably going to generate some exposures to penalties, fines, and potentially a legal battle while you try to resolve who was responsible for what. So I'll throw it open to anybody that wants to take it first.
Yeah, I'll go first and mention specifically the place to start there is to read the contract that you have with.
Joe, you're cutting in and out there.
Did I miss you?
Yeah, you cut in.
Kind of broke up.
I cut out. Okay, sorry about that. I think the place to start is to read the contract that you have between you and your computer person, whether it's an MSP or your colo or your data center. Specifically focus on what is in the contract, but most important, what is not in the contract. Compare that to just from a common sense point of view. Put together scenarios of what happens if this happens or that happens. With small companies, you can litigate till the cows come home, but meanwhile you're going to be out of business, and then it's a moot point, in my opinion.
Brian or Emery,
Yeah.
anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just kind of, go ahead, Emery.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I was just going to kind of pick up on Joe's point there. We see this dynamic all the time, especially with smaller businesses. Our customers who make assumptions that our MSP is handling our security, or our IT guy, he's very good with security and he's handling it. And they may be doing their best, or they may have just a different understanding of what they believe their responsibilities are. And that's a problem, of course, but there's even a bigger problem, is that many times there is nobody within or outside of an organization looking at the holistic view of the organization. Who are all of our vendors? Who are all of our customers? Who are all of our third parties, whatever they might be? How do we engage with them? How do we share data with them? Are we considering our employees? Are they being trained properly? What are all the systems that we use? What are all the software packages out there that we have and use? Do we even know everything we have as an organization that's within our walls from a IT perspective? And the problem is, if you don't have somebody looking kind of at, like I said, as a holistic top-down view, something is probably getting missed. And that's the thing that's going to hurt you in the end as an organization. And I think as Brian mentioned before, a lot of times the big breaches with these big organizations aren't going through their direct systems. They're coming in through small, independent, third party systems and then infiltrating in. So again, that's why it's important to look at this from a holistic perspective and not just make an assumption that it's being taken care of. Better to validate up front than assume that it's happening.
Hey guys, we have a few questions that have been in the chat room. So let me throw out a few, and we can open it up to broader questions shortly. But there was a couple questions about insurance, and we talked a little bit about insurance, but are there any best practices in terms of firms that offer, better policies around cyber insurance? Or, I mean, should a young company just go to their insurance broker and say, what do I need? Or are there specialty firms out there that young companies, should be staying on top of and maybe getting ahead of what their insurance brokers know? I think one person said there was, they've got a policy from a company called Hiscox. I don't know that company, but how do you stay on top of, what is best practices in getting insurance for your company?
I'll take the lead on that because I'm the oldest guy here. From my point of view, the place to go or to start is the focus on companies, the insurance carriers that focus on small businesses. For instance, a Chubb or a Cigna, as the case may be. Chubb has very good coverage. It's very expansive, specifically for cyber theft. They review it constantly. If you pick exposures, meaning you have a large customer and you provide them with a certain type of service or product, you may want to get specific and talk to the underwriter, and they may push you to a particular carrier that handles that narrow sliver of coverage. But I think that if you start with the big boys, they will provide you with just the general coverage, and it's not cheap, but more important, it's expansive, which is in theory what you need as a small business.
I would add on to that some of the things to consider. The when you're doing the cybersecurity planning, for example, as we started a while back, what are some of the gotchas? How well prepared are you to get that cyber insurance, and does it cover what you need? So when you start, we talked earlier about a company that has done a lot of the due diligence and has more of their ducks in the row is going to be able to get a better policy or a better priced policy than one that says, I need cyber insurance because my biggest customer told me if I don't get it, I'm no longer going to be able to do business with them. So I think there's, it's becoming more and more of a prolific offering. We're seeing in the marketplace, there are a lot of, even the insurance brokers that are representing these large companies are pushing out to their customers because, one, they see it as a revenue opportunity, and two, they see it as an additional service that they can provide to their customers. But I think it's also important to check the fine print as you're going through this process and figure out which, what activities you can engage in to help drive down that cost and be efficient and have the coverage that you need.
Okay. Another question, I don't know if you guys, are aware of any data, and those questions sort of from the investor perspective, which is, as we fund young companies and they reach certain milestones, how do we know that what they're doing regarding a cybersecurity plan is right for that milestone? And I mean, is there data that says, for example, if you're this kind of company, you should be spending X amount of dollars. If you're this type of company, you should be spending, 3X that amount of dollars. I mean, is there data out there that correlates the milestone of a company's progress, its size, and what others are spending so that you know whether you're overspending or underspending? So how much data is out there around, that topic?
I'll front end this from the perspective of I am not aware of a lot of data that would point one way or the other. But I would say that, as we talked earlier in the discussion, that a cybersecurity plan is a living, breathing document that needs to be reviewed on a periodic basis, probably annually, to see how your needs have changed and evolved, to see if there are different different parameters that need to be introduced or updating of plans to keep you with that, that more efficient allocation of the cybersecurity planning resources. And I think that'll dictate, what you're going to be spending in that area. So a company that's, a 5 to 10 person entity in 18 to 24 months is now a 50 person entity. That plan needs to be updated in a number of ways, right? And to keep you right sized with the threats and exposures.
Got it.
And Mark, in addition to that, I would suggest using COVID as the backdrop. Are people working remotely, or are they all in one location? Those are a lot of things you got to consider specifically related to the endpoints, which are a lot of times that's where people get in right now. And that is an issue. So it's really not just the size of the company, but it's also the number of locations and also the defense at each location. If you got a remote location in Japip, how much data do you want to, or how much time do you want to spend doing that? But you need some.
Yeah. I think one of the takeaways for me certainly is like, we would not know whether a company is overspending or underspending, but clearly if they don't have a plan, then there's not even a basis for a discussion. So, putting the plan in place is sort of that guidepost to, are you doing enough? You're doing too much, you're doing too little, because you can't answer that without having that, having dug into the plan. So that's certainly a takeaway message for me. Another question came around, especially post-COVID. Some companies are thinking about, secure intranets or, VPNs. How do the VPNs and these secure intranets, what's their future, especially post-COVID, and how do they fit into this whole scheme of cybersecurity?
So I can start off with that one a little bit, and you guys feel free to add on. With the deployment of so many remote employees over the last 18 months, the initial scramble was to get them connected so they continue to be functional. But in a lot of households, that didn't necessarily mean that it was a company issued computer, or that company issued computer was not shared by other members of the family to do other things. And the challenge really becomes what monitoring capability beyond just the VPN connection, which is, should be a secure connection. What monitoring is available beyond that? And what you're starting to see a lot of in the marketplace are these security operations centers that where a vendor will provide that 24/7 monitoring to make sure that what looks to be an update to Microsoft Office is in fact an update to Microsoft Office and not some infiltration attempt. So the more proliferated you are, especially in a remote environment, the more critical it's becoming to start looking at other services from a lot of the providers that are out there to lock down that data transmission and make sure it is secure.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of our allotted time. What I will do for those that are still online, if you do have any questions at this point, don't why don't you just unblock yourself or unmic yourself, and just throw it open to anybody who's listening now that might have a question. Please do it instead of via the chat room. Just one at a time. Ask a question verbally. And for those that have hung in there, thank you so much. And I hope you had a great exposure to this topic. So we'll keep the line open as long as there's questions. If there's none, we'll wrap it up.
Mark, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the team for allowing us to present. I hope I hope all the attendees found it beneficial. And if we don't get any questions now, feel free to reach out through Joe or any of us, and we'll try and get answers for your team.
Thank you. And we do put a follow-up note to all the attendees, getting some feedback if they have questions. And we can, get them directed to you if they have specific questions in mind. They want to speak to you personally. So we will do that in a follow-up email. So I think with that, I want to thank Brian, John, Joe, and Emery for hosting, our first sort of panel discussion webinar. And I hope for the audience it was instructive, and I think there's a lot of takeaway actions they can do. So thank you, everybody. I think we're going to depart now, and everybody please have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. You do the same.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you.